Hello, everyone. Today is Saturday, April 11th, 2020. I'm Bob Diebold, Vice Chairman of the Committee for the Global Endeavor. Today, we commence once again with Phase 7 now, and the 34th webinar in our series of webinars on the topic, comparing and contrasting the true teachings of Jesus with the traditional tenets and practices of organized institutional Christianity. This is topic 8 in the study guide called Revelation Revealed. Neil Waldrop is the author and also the chairman of the committee. I am turning the webinar over to Neil now. Neil, over to you.
Thank you, Bob. It's once again a great pleasure to be with you and with our other participants. We have taken a break for just over 1 month. The preceding webinar was on the 29th of February, an opportunity that occurs only once every 4 years, of course. And we are indeed resuming, as you said, our series pertaining to topic 8 of my document, Revelation Revealed, that I wrote in the middle of 2016. For viewers who may not have been following our series, I should emphasize that it would be greatly to your advantage to have that document on hand, and even more so, the supplement that I wrote in the middle of last year called Living the Real Religion of Jesus. Both of these documents are available for download from the website of the Committee for the Global Endeavor. I give you the citation as follows: www.globalendeavor.net. I say again, www.globalendeavor.net. In this website citation, the word Global Endeavor is treated as if it were a single word without any space or punctuation in the middle. The links to download Revelation Revealed and Living the Real Religion of Jesus are about 2/3 of the way down the page on the homepage of the website. Now, as a practical matter, we really will be concentrating on the second document that I mentioned, my essay, Living the Real Religion of Jesus. In particular, we will be going to the bottom of page 11 of that document. Since you do not have any opportunity to ask us questions during the webinar, we offer you the option of sending in a question or two by email. If you wish to do that, you would use the email address at the bottom of the homepage on the website I gave you. The email address is as follows: info@globalendeavor.net. If you send us a question and we decide to use it during a future program, we reserve the right to edit the wording. And in that event, you would get an answer to your question from the entire panel of participants, not just from me personally. So now we really will go into the body of the discussion. As I stated just a minute ago, we are at the bottom of page 11 of the essay, Living the Real Religion of Jesus. We have just begun the section called The Mission and the Timeline. We proceeded on February 29th to begin discussing the first paragraph of the excerpt that follows that brief heading paragraph. I will proceed to read the heading paragraph just to create the mood of the discussion, and then we will proceed with the comments from individuals. The paragraph reads as follows: The Mission and the Timeline. Shortly before Christ Michael left Salvington in order to begin serving as the Paradise Son who would bestow himself on Urantia in the human form of Jesus of Nazareth, his older brother Emmanuel of Salvington, the Union of Days, the ambassador of the Paradise Trinity to the local universe of Nebadon, gave Michael detailed instructions on behalf of the Universal Father. Although these instructions extend through sections 1, 2, and 3 of paper 120, in other words, from page 1325 to page 1330 of the single column edition, we shall concentrate on the following 3 paragraphs from section 3, which is entitled Further Counsel and Advice. Stephen, would you read that paragraph that appears in the box at the bottom of the page, just that one paragraph, please?
In your relations to the social order, we advise that you confine your efforts largely to spiritual regeneration and intellectual emancipation. Avoid all entanglements with the economic structure and the political commitments of your day. More especially, devote yourself to living the ideal religious life on Urantia.
Thank you. During the discussion on February 29th, I pointed out that this set of instructions from Emmanuel to Michael differed quite considerably from the understandings and instructions that pertain to the first and second epical revelations, the regime of the planetary prince before he rebelled, the initial arrangements of Adam and Eve before they defaulted. On the other hand, it resembled the arrangement that also applied to the bestowal of Melchizedek in the days of Abraham. And so what we are going to do now, gentlemen, lady also, is to discuss the reasons for these instructions that Emmanuel gave to Michael, on the understanding that the instructions are the Father's will. And so the fact that they are the Father's will is a given. What we are going to discuss is the possible reasons why they were the Father's will and what the implications were. Now, one of our colleagues who is not here today, Marvin Gowron, pointed out in a preceding webinar that there is a difference in the timeline, that the timeline for the first and second epical revelations was indeed indefinite, extending for a very long period of time, that the chief revelators associated with the first and second epical revelations were intended to stay on Urantia for not only generations, not only centuries, but perhaps for millennia, it would seem. Whereas that certainly was not the case of the bestowal of Melchizedek in the days of Abraham, nor the bestowal of Christ Michael in the human form of Jesus of Nazareth. George, does this difference in timeline influence you as perhaps one of the underlying reasons for the instructions that Emmanuel gave to Michael in this regard?
Yes and no. Yes, in the sense that Michael and Melchizedek were only here for a very short time, but their influence extended over, millennia. So, over the last, Melchizedek's influence went worldwide in 3,000 years, and Michael's went worldwide in 2,000 years. And so both exerted a long-term influence, even though they weren't here, which fits with the instructions that Emmanuel gives Michael. And in fact, there's another aspect to the difference in the revelations you cited. The first two are fundamentally different from the last three. And you pointed out that they were intended to be physical representatives of universe government here continuously. And they were from the planetary prince until Adam and Eve is about 450,000 years. And if you include Van, who was part of the original staff of the planetary prince, that's how you get a continuous presence of universe government visible presence of universe government here on this planet for almost 500,000 years. So, but that ended with Adam and Eve's default. And the last three have been, well, some of Melchizedek, although Melchizedek was here for a short time, some of his teachings are preserved in the Old Testament. Some of Jesus's teachings are preserved in the New Testament. And of course, the Urantia book comes as a written text, initially written by the celestial personalities who sponsored it. So that really, to me, seems like a more fundamental reason for Emmanuel to give this advice to Michael, because we live on an abnormal world. it's isolated. I mean, we've gone over this before, but the, what is the need for agondanters? We are, because we are going to ascend from this world, we're classified as agondanters, and agondanters are not a typical kind of ascender. They're fundamentally different. In fact, the fundamental difference is such that we'll have our own residential area on Jerusalem, and this grouping of agondanters goes all the way up in the ascent through the local and super universes, and then reappears on Paradise. So being born on this world leaves an indelible mark, which is never erased. And it seems to me there's good and sufficient reason for focusing on spiritual regeneration and intellectual emancipation, because that's what we need. That's the first and most important thing that we need, because we don't have anything else. We don't have an enduring tradition that's lasted for tens of thousands of years. We don't have visible representatives of universe government. We really don't have much of anything here in terms of visible support. Let's put it that way. We have lots of invisible support, but no visible support to speak of. So to me, I think that represents a pretty strong reason for focusing on personal religious experience.
Thank you. Bob, I'd like to spend a little bit from George's comments, but then turn to you in a more general way. That George has emphasized the contrast of the lack of a personal, visible presence of the representatives of the planetary government, which is, of course, is quite true. And he also agreed that there is a difference in the timeline, which was the basic question that I asked. But I'd like you to put those 2 points together, if you could, in association with the explanation that a mighty messenger provides in paper 52 of planetary mortal epochs, wherein each of the epochs that the mighty messenger describes in that paper does entail consideration of the full range of human experiences, not just religion and spirituality. Bob?
Neil, I'm not sure I understand the paper 52 reference here.
What I'm saying is that the description on paper 52 that the mighty messenger provides consists of a narrative, or an analysis, if you prefer, of the different epochs of human life on an inhabited planet. And in each of these sections of his analysis in that paper, he talks about all aspects of human life, not just about religion and spirituality.
Yes. Okay. I think I know where you want to take this now. Let me first just provide a little bit of background on George's use of agondanters, because I think it's relevant to the way that I would answer your question. In paper 50, they define what an agondanter is. And let me just read that paragraph so that I can kind of move into the answer to your question here. It says, and this is the section that talks about the rewards of isolation, which Urantia was under, of course, both from the rebellion and even through the time when Adam and Eve were here. And it says, on Jerusalem, the ascenders, this is a Lenonidek son of the Reserve Corps, by the way. It says, on Jerusalem, the ascenders of these isolated worlds occupy a residential sector by themselves and are known as agondanters, meaning evolutionary will creatures who can believe without seeing, persevere when isolated, and triumph over insuperable difficulties, even when alone. And we keep this all the way through until we get to Havona, and then it goes away. but then shows up again when we arrive in paradise, when an agondoctor arrives in paradise during this ascension career. So that's just to clean that up a little bit and to provide that for anybody listening to this. What I would say about the typical, and I was going to use the word dispensation, because that's what happens with these epochs. I want to say it that way. The fourth epochal revelation, and George made me think about this when he said a yes and no to the timeline, started at pretty much at Pentecost, when all the sleeping survivors are then those that would be ascended and go to a mansion world would go. During this dispensation, which is theoretically still on, even though the fifth epochal revelation is here, we're not told whether or not this is a new dispensation or not. So we assume that it's on. The Master Seraphim returned. And in fact, where the first two revelations, Planetary Prince and Adam and Eve, were concerned with the entire social, economic, and political functioning of the society on the planet. I brought up I should say, re-brought up the idea of agondonters, because in fact, we don't have any visible planetary prince team here. We are pretty much believe without seeing, so to speak, I guess, preserve when isolated, persevere when isolated. So for the fifth epochal revelation in this dispensation, or that started at Pentecost, these Master Seraphim are concerned, it's a spiritual government here, are concerned with all those political, economic, and social aspects of society that the planetary prince and Adam and Eve would have been also. The third and fourth revelation took a different tack, and I think that's where Marvin brought up the Bidwayer's idea that there's a causality here. What I heard from that paragraph in paper 195, Marvin brought up, was that the causality says if there's spirit pressure from above, it will affect those leaders and teachers who will be able to provide a cosmic perspective for all those aspects of social, political, and economic areas that are current unseen cousins, celestial helpers, are desperately trying to have us figure out what to do. So I think I'll leave it right there. Brought up a bunch of ideas here, dispensations, the fact that we're still probably under the fourth epochal revelation dispensation. Back over to you.
I have 2 points that I'd like to pursue briefly before I turn to the next speaker. The description of the agondaughter capabilities and roles that you provided was very interesting. I would like to put to you a question that has occurred to me, I think a conclusion, that the situation of an agondaughter occurs because he or she grows up in a world in which there is no spiritual representation in a visible form of the spiritual government. So now the question, and perhaps a conclusion, is that if Urantia eventually returns to the fact that we will have in the future at some moment a visible representation, then the inhabitants of Urantia in that future time would not be entitled to the name agondaughter. Are you in agreement on that?
Wow, never thought of that. There's that curveball that you tend to throw every so often. Yeah? That's a very interesting thought. I think you're right. I think that without the visible magisterial sun, or I suppose that Jesus being visible, but it's really the rewards of isolation. So it might not necessarily be the visibility, because I think maybe we're making an assumption here. But it in fact has been an isolated sphere, and I think that the DNA of this sphere will carry on potentially until the times of light and life. But that's really a speculation, and I think it's a great question to ask.
Well, I'm glad that you have congratulated me on my supply of curveballs. You see, before every program, Bob sends me a supply of baseballs that I keep on hand next to my feet here. And sometimes they end up being a curveball. Yes. Now, the other point that I'd like to confirm with you is one in which I believe you and I agree, that the idea of a dispensation has to do with the concept of a dispensational resurrection. And we are told in the Urantia book that Jesus conducted a dispensational resurrection at the end of his life as a step before he returned to Salvington. I see nothing in the Urantia book which would tend to indicate that any dispensational any dispensational resurrection has been conducted since. Is that likewise your feeling about this?
Yeah, that's what I tried to bring that up. I'm still pretty well convinced, without finding anything that directly or indirectly even points to that we're still under the fourth epical revelations dispensation, which includes those 5 levels that Jesus spoke of, the phases of the kingdom. We may be somewhere between phase 1 and 2. Back to you.
Okay, Doreen, now I will carry out my threat to call on another person. You are the one. And we regret that your internet connection is not working, but we see this brilliant image of a telephone that effectively symbolizes your presence.
Okay, no problem. So most of what I understood and had written also was some of the things that the both of them said, the guys. But, when I was looking at, okay, so what is this? Why do we have epical revelations? And, it said you have to uplift the planet. And each stage of the way has a purpose. So the planetary prince comes with a staff. 300,000 years, you're dealing with what? Primitive people. That is not easy. So I was thinking, okay, now what are they doing? They're setting up councils, and they have all kinds of instruction, schools for instruction. So it is, for labor, agriculture, teach them how to survive, teach them how to live better, how to plant food, how to store food. Animal domestication, all this record keeping, sanitation, and on in these schools. And I think that was wonderful. And that's what you do when you have uncivilized people, humans, that so-called humans that are semi-savage anyway. Now, so the next plan to me, God's plan is now you send the next, after, of course, the default and everything got messed up. So then you send the biological uplifters. So to infuse into the races a better product. And that to me was, okay, well, that makes perfect sense. Genetics and spiritual potentials of humanity, because if you don't upgrade the genetic and get sometimes a better product, how are you going to infuse spirituality, God consciousness, or anything of a superior nature? And then I was thinking of some of the things that Sadler said in one of his tapes, and he said it's like talking to the savages about the stock market. They would have no understanding of what it means. So each epic brought a different change in another direction. And okay, so then you came to the Melchizedek, so they failed the second. And then
I'm sorry, you had Adam and Eve as the second, right?
Yeah, and then the Melchizedek came. And of course had to reveal religion. So in other words, why Jesus, came to uplift the idea of religion into the human mind, the personal revelation of God to man, and then God's coming down to man and bringing man up to God. And this is the cycle. So it's not, he couldn't have had any other reason to come here. This is what he does. And usually there are others that do this preliminary to create a son, because if I remember that the magisterial sons, they can't do exactly what Jesus did, what the Michaels do. And that is, they can't, I think the spirit of truth, they cannot bestow, if that's Michael's prerogative, if I remember clearly. But anyway, so I forgot almost the question. Anyway, so, okay, so there is a plan. And I think that it's, it makes so much sense to build civilization because it's all, I guess, building towards the realization of the supreme anyway. So the supreme will grow in proportion to the planets, the systems, the constellation, all of this collective destiny brought about by the potentials, according to the planetary growth. And that progress is assured, from generation to generation. The biological stock, the planet improves its overall civilization potentials and attainment. So the biology is the basis of culture. Culture and spiritual attainment is the gauge of approximation to a planetary's destiny. And I don't know where I'm going with this, but, everything has to be laid down before the next phase. Even if it fails, there is still a next phase. Nothing is ever lost. So, with all the stuff I read, it's very uncomfortable to talk on the phone. It's not the same thing, but I'm adjusting. So I don't know if I answered your question as always, but I just said what I had to say. But the best thing that I found, absolutely best thing, which really brought tears to my eyes when I had read it, not this time, but before, but even though, is that a descendant of Anton and Fanta was able to achieve the highest level of personality attainment, intellectually and spiritually. But I've just like, how is this possible where all the others defaulted? So out of something bad came something wonderful, just wonderful. And it really touched my heart, the courage that this person, Van had, and Amadon, and the College of Revealed Religions and all that, was saved and continue to, I guess, pass it on from another generation to generation, even though a lot of the other stuff that they had, the schools and all, I guess when the chief goes down, then people lose faith in that, and of course that creates the chaos, and that's what Caligastia did. Okay.
All right, Doreen, thank you. I do have one question stemming from your early narration of the circumstances of the original epochs. I wonder whether, in your view, any of these primitive and human beings and savages actually ended up in Brooklyn.
That's not a nice question.
I take it that's a no.
I don't measure somebody's their spirituality or anything like that. Only the gods could do that. I only have an opinion on some things, but I think that's not my position, and I don't think anybody on the planet could ever do that.
I must assure you and the viewers also that my question was intended to be humorous. Obviously, we're talking about different eras of civilization and society, and everyone living today is certainly not a primitive human being and not a savage either. Stephen.
Well.
All right. You
sorry.
think some of your neighbors are savages, do you? All right. I guess I will now turn to Stephen and say that you have a wide range of possibilities to comment on anything that anyone has said before you. And of course, anything that has occurred to you that you have come up with from your own perspective.
Well, before I start, I just want to put a bug in your head that I don't have to do it now. I can do it now. I can do it later. But I've sort of put together from just these few pages from Emmanuel's instructions, kind of the best rationale I've seen for the motivation and ideals of the global endeavor. Now, you may have already sort of consciously or unconsciously done this, but I just found these, to juxtapose these different texts together is a really good explication of what the intent of the global endeavor is. So we can do that later. I just want to let you know I can do that if you want.
First, if I could react immediately, I am delighted that you have, and I would be very deeply interested in your exposition or your assembly of texts. At some future moment, I would certainly request that you send it along to me.
Okay. Well, basically, I agree with George's first point that there's more than one criterion here when we're talking about intervals of epical revelation. I think in your number one, the key word is intended, okay? The spiritual beings who sponsored these epical revelations were intended to remain on Urantia for an exceedingly long time. However, they weren't. And so that's one factoid that we need to keep in mind. The other, which is just as important, if not more so, which George said, was that the repercussions of the third and fourth revelations can be considered to be just as important. I don't know how you measure these things, but the repercussions of the third and fourth revelations were very, very important. I don't know if you can say as important as the first and second. Maybe you could say more important. It's above our pay grade to measure these things. I'm sure people up there in the planetary government have means of measuring the qualitative, positive, and negative repercussions of differing epical revelations. But there is a paragraph on the top of page 5 that you quoted from paper 81, and I'll just read a sentence toward the middle of that. It says, this is an interesting phrase, the first part of this: only moral and spiritual adjustments can be made on the spur of the moment. Now that by itself is an interesting statement. I'm not sure what they mean by spur of the moment, but let's let that pass. And then they say, and even these require the passing of time for the full outworking of their material and social repercussions. So this is a very clear statement that moral and spiritual adjustments do have material and social repercussions in history. This was the point I was trying to make, I don't know, whenever it was last time I was here, that both Jesus and Melchizedek must have known that their spiritual teachings were not, could not be limited to the spiritual and moral realms. They had to have material and social repercussions. So I'm just kind of emphasizing again that I think it's inaccurate to make too much of a separation or a distinction between spiritual revelation and material and social repercussions of those. They have to go together in human society, and one has to affect the other. So I guess that's the main points I wanted to make. here.
Thank you. I would simply offer a clarification for viewers. Stephen was quoting from a paragraph from paper 81 that I circulated as part of the background information for participants. Specifically, this paragraph is paragraph 40 in section 6 of paper 81, and it really is very interesting. I think the earlier part of the paragraph is one that I would emphasize, wherein the Archangel states, no great social or economic change should be attempted suddenly. That these matters require quite a bit of time to being carried out.
And just so you know, the rest of the second part of that sentence is one of the parts of that little coagulation that I put together for the global endeavor. It has a direct relevance for the global endeavor, but I'll let that be.
Well, I thank you for that, and I appreciate and look forward to your efforts. I would certainly want to give careful consideration to the document that you've been working on. Gentlemen and lady, I would now like to go on to another factor about which I will inquire, and that is to discuss the topic of the emergency provisions of the bestowal plan and whether these emergency provisions had something to do with the instructions that Emmanuel gave to Michael. Specifically, the background in this comes from a paragraph that the Divine Counselor wrote in section 4 of paper 7. And as a convenience for you and for the viewers, I will read that paragraph. It goes as follows: 2, the bestowal plan. The next universal plan is the great Father Revelation enterprise of the Eternal Son and his coordinate sons. This is the proposal of the Eternal Son and consists of his bestowal of the sons of God upon the evolutionary creations, there to personalize and factualize, to incarnate and make real the love of the Father and the mercy of the Son to the creatures of all universes. Inherent in the bestowal plan and as a provisional feature of this ministration of love, the Paradise Sons act as rehabilitators of that which misguided creature will has placed in spiritual jeopardy. Whenever and wherever there occurs a delay in the functioning of the attainment plan, if rebellion perchance should mar or complicate this enterprise, then do the emergency provisions of the bestowal plan become active forthwith. The Paradise Sons stand pledged and ready to function as retrievers, to go into the very realms of rebellion and there restore the spiritual status of the spheres. And such a heroic service a coordinate Creator Son did perform on Urantia in connection with his experiential bestowal career of sovereignty acquirement. I think that the concluding sentences of this paragraph that I have just read, paragraph 5 in section 4 of paper 7, establish that Michael's bestowal on Urantia in the human form of Jesus of Nazareth did at least fall under the emergency provisions of the bestowal plan. So my question for you, gentlemen and lady, is whether we can infer that perhaps there is some provision of the emergency provisions of the bestowal plan which calls for the Paradise Son to concentrate on spiritual and religious matters. And of course, in asking this question, we are speculating, and I must say to you that I am not making that assertion as a matter of my knowledge. I do not know that, but I would like to ask you to react to this possibility and give me your opinion. Bob, could you start with that, please?
Sure, Neil. Well, we do know that the third epical revelation was an emergency. The planet was losing the idea of God as a monotheistic concept. So that was preserved, of course, in the Hebrews. I think in taking a look at this, and I had not really, before I saw this in your paper here this week, I hadn't really thought of the fourth epical revelation as being an emergency provision. But it does make sense in the fact that the typical bestowal, a magisterial son bestowal, for example, I'm sorry, it's typically a nirvanal son who's a bestowal, it's a paradise son, comes when the planet is spiritually developed and ripe for future advances. This was not where Urantia was, of course, at the beginning of our common era now. So I think that this particular idea that you have, and if we are going to talk a little bit further, I've got some other thoughts that I'd like to add to this, but I think just to really answer your question and get it kicked off here, I'd say that this particular bestowal, Michael had a concept probably many thousands of years, even before he sent Melchizedek to do the emergency reparation of spiritual content that he did 2,000 years before Jesus came. So I think that I would have to say a positive to that one, that in fact this is an emergency, and we can get into some details as to what part of that plan might actually be the reclamation. Back to you.
Thank you, George. In effect, Bob confirmed my opinion that this paragraph justifies the statement that Christ Michael, operating on Urantia, was operating under the emergency provisions of the bestowal plan. But my question to him and to you is whether we could infer that these emergency provisions, in effect, specify that the bestowal should pertain either exclusively or almost exclusively to spiritual and religious matters.
No, I wouldn't think so, because, well, as Stephen pointed out previously, it's all connected. In other words, there's such a thing as pure faith, or faith which is purely spiritual. I mean, you could say, in a certain sense, the insight which we call faith has nothing to do with the intellect, and I think there's some meaning to that. But you can't spiritually grow without faith interacting with mind. Growth is a relationship between the two. The adjuster is eternal in nature, and he doesn't grow, but the relationship between us and him grows in the soul. So it's trying to draw a hard and fast line between spirit, mind, and matter is difficult, especially since if you dissect a living thing, it's no longer living. But in terms of, going back to your previous point, that obviously, as I said, I think Jesus, his primary mission and pretty much his exclusive mission was spiritual uplift. The Urantia book, I believe personally, is another emergency action. I mean, it comes a mere 2,000 years after Jesus, when normally the time span is anywhere from 10 to 100,000 years on a normal world, which we're not. But so I think the Urantia book is also an emergency, whether or not it's part of the emergency provisions of the bestowal plan, I don't know. But in and of itself, it appears to me to be an emergency action. I think in some sense, similar to the bestowal of Melchizedek, who, the Melchizedek commission, where they were thrown back on their own devices, and They sought guidance from the system government, and they said, well, do what you think is best. So Machiaventa incarnated, because that's what they decided to do to address the problem. And well, I guess that's I don't know if I've answered your question, but I don't think there's any reason why an epical bestowal or even an action under the emergency provisions of the bestowal plan have to be limited to a strictly spiritual focus.
Thank you. I would once again comment not only to you, but to all of us that we are speculating here, and that personal opinions in this question are certainly valid and worthwhile. We are seeking to demonstrate pluralism and diversity. And indeed, we are also doing our best to try to understand the underlying reasons behind the instructions that Emmanuel gave Michael, having started from the premise that these instructions were indeed the Father's will. Now, before I turn to Stephen, I would like to do a little bit of a vocabulary clarification, because we have been using the word emergency in two distinct ways. The event of an emergency is one way in which people have been using that word. And I personally agree that the bestowal of Melchizedek was an emergency event because of the danger of the knowledge of God dying out on Urantia. Indeed, the revelators tell us that. And then we could ask whether the bestowal of Michael in the human form of Jesus of Nazareth was also an emergency event. I don't know. I think one could make a case for that. One could also make a case against that. Then the question of the Urantia book, the fifth epical revelation, as an emergency event. I tend to agree with George that it was an emergency event. So this is one way in which we are using the word emergency in qualifying or describing the event. The other way, however, it has to do with the bestowal plan and the emergency provisions of the bestowal plan. And here we indeed are speculating. So there are two different ways in which we are using this word emergency. And now for any efforts that Stephen may wish to make to clarify the situation, I turn to him.
Okay, I'd like to look at the very last sentence on page 5. It continues on to page 6. It says, whenever and wherever there occurs a delay in the functioning of the attainment plan, if rebellion perchance should mar or complicate this enterprise, then do emergency provisions of the bestowal plan become active forthwith. So I'd like to emphasize that the emergency provisions come into play seemingly according to the sentence if rebellion is involved. Okay, and as we know, rebellion does not only have spiritual repercussions, it has planetary repercussions on all levels: social, economic, genetic, whatever. So rebellion is a holistic, organic disruption. And that's in conjunction with what they call the functioning of the attainment plan. Now, I'm not sure exactly what they mean by the attainment plan. That's a phrase I don't think they use very often. But I would think that the attainment plan is something that's global, planetary, and involves all aspects of human civilization. So when you put those together, you've got attainment plan, rebellion, and emergency provisions, which makes me think that even though Jesus's function here was to uplift the planet spiritually, it came in the context of a rebellion that affected every aspect of human life on the planet. And that's what constituted an emergency, a cosmic rebellion. So I don't know, I'll just throw that in there.
Thank you. I think your remarks and those of your predecessors reflect the fact that we are struggling to try to understand something that is difficult. The revelators have mentioned the bestowal plan and the emergency provisions, and we are simply reaching for an understanding of the circumstance. I appreciate your linkage to the phrase, the functioning of the attainment plan. And once again, for the benefit of viewers, we are discussing the details of paragraph 5 in section 4 of paper 7 by a divine counselor. Doreen, you have quite a bit of emergency here. I think the first emergency has to do with the fact that your internet connection isn't working at the moment. But maybe you could turn to some other aspects of the emergency that we have been discussing from a spiritual perspective. Doreen, are you there?
I have to unmute. I forget that
Okay.
this is a different operation. Okay, so, you know, but then I thought about it. And when the book said, it said at the time of Jesus' birth, your answer was experiencing a remarkable revival of spiritual thinking and religious living. Even European civilization was blooming, you know, to the, you know, of course, with the Roman Empire. And the Greek language and culture was spreading, and the influence of Jewish, the moral teachings and the religious teachings was, you know, influencing now. So there were things that he chose to come at a very good time. Well, what happened? You know, he foresaw the future, because, you know, when you lay down certain plans, that there is always, you know, these hiccups or whatever you want to say, that you saw which way, of course, human beings are going to destroy the very thing that was good. So they did have a wonderful ethics and morals at that time, but it doesn't mean you live it. You may have a lot of writings, and it certainly was, was given to them and for a long period of time, but then things happened. And I was remembering in the book where Jesus said, you know, to the people when they were attacking him, and he said, go read Hosea. Okay. They were attacking him for not following, of course, you know, all their rules and regulations. And what it said, you know, the orthodoxy, of course, he was always breaking it. So I was looking at that, and it was funny. It said that, number one, of course, each generation must either redo or repudiate the covenant in its own way. And Hosea's critique of Israel's society they said it went very deep, more than condemnation of social immorality or political confusion or, you know, any kind of religious formalism and all that. He was concerned with human motives, with devotion of the heart, with things which people place their trust in. They went to the temples to get something, he said, out of religion: harmony, security, prosperity, peace. And what happens? The priests and the prophets exploited that. And it's just like in Christianity, same thing. The priests were feeding on the sin. They lacked the steadfastness or trustworthiness of true confidence, divine love of God. So Jesus asked his heroes to read Hosea, you know, and it made so much sense. You had to uplift, you had to give them that God was the love of God, not to go through anyone else, that this is personal relationship at the utmost, highest level for all his creation. And even, you know, talking to the apostles, of course, they didn't get it. So how do you expect these people to react to him? Of course, if they're threatened. Here is a guy that's coming out and saying who he is, and he brings something beautiful. And he tried to explain how, you know, religion is not, it's growing. It's not always static. It has to evolve. And you have to be free. because they had this concept of the bondage and the slavery of superstition, the rituals, and it retards the social and moral and spiritual progression. So he's talking about true religion, a superior religion, and it not to become contaminated with rituals and cults, and this was how all the sects came about. But true religion is alive. Now, how do you think they would receive that? They're talking, they don't have the spirit of truth at that time. Maybe some of them didn't, most of them maybe didn't have a thought adjuster. So, the equivalent, they said Jesus' religious teachings must, of course it must be for everybody. And when you crystallize religion, what happens? It's the equivalent of spiritual death. And that's what they said. Intellectual crystallization of religious concerns is the equivalent of spiritual death. So what did he see? Why did he come? Even though things were probably okay, but he had to plant the religion of the spirit, and which some of the prophets realized. And that's where you have joy and liberty, and and you do the loving service and the ennoble, and they were biased to the heathens and they were biased to other people. So it becomes like all other things. As soon as you have a hierarchy, that kills it. That kills it because people need to be free to pursue their own ideas, their own search for meaning. And of course, spiritual meaning and all the rest of the stuff. I mean, I had so much information on economics and all that, but whether you talk about it or not is irrelevant. But the the morals and the ethics all come along with the religion. It's not that it's only finding God, which is the primary thing, but through God, you come to recognize and transform your thinking, and you go deeper and you realize that everything else starts to come into place. Your mind starts to recognize the truth, because what carries into the future? What delay a plan so that it's just for that generation? Absolutely not. It had to be lasting, and what's lasting, of course, is the truths. You have to have the truths and cultivate them, and the values that come along with the truth, and the awareness to preserve it. So he had to have that spiritual message, and of course, love, had to be a positive appeal. Okay, I know you want to cut me off. That's fine.
I don't want to cut you off, but I would like to ask you if I'm reaching an appropriate conclusion from your interesting remarks. It seems to me that many of your remarks can be summed up as stating that Jesus's concentration on spiritual and religious matters occurred as a practical factor because that was the greatest need at the time. Am I correct now in interpreting what you've said?
Yeah, but it had to be lasting. That's the point. It wasn't just at that time. That's why they had a difficult time, I suppose, trying to write the, the Ermia lectures and tried to put it into a language of today, because the same thing is happening, over and over again throughout history. So yeah, you need something lasting. What's lasting? You have to talk to the heart and soul of the people. You have to bring them into that higher consciousness, the area, of worship and wisdom. How do they acquire wisdom? You have to first have that ability to recognize the consciousness of God. And of course, after Jesus left, he was able to give them at least the people who had eyes to see and ears to hear. The spirit of truth, which leads you into what you need. And it's just, to me, it all fits together. It's so wonderful. And I'll only say, I had a couple of stories that I found, and I thought they were really interesting. And this was, can I go on for 2 minutes?
Well, I think perhaps we ought to go on, because each of us has to have a certain amount of sharing with others, and you've spoken your turn, I think.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bob, I see you motioning for additional comments?
Yes, just quick, Neil, I know we need to move on. A couple of factual thoughts here. In paper 20 by a divine count, by a, who is this now? Let me just get this right. This is a perfecter of wisdom from Uversa, talking about the bestowals. When a bestowal son has mastered the experience of living the mortal life, when he has achieved perfection of attunement with his indwelling adjuster, thereupon he begins that part of his planetary mission designed to illuminate the minds and inspire the souls of his brethren in the flesh. Here's the part that I wanted to focus on, and I would have underlined this or highlighted it. As teachers, these sons are exclusively devoted to the spiritual enlightenment of the mortal races of the worlds of their sojourn. Every planet out of 10 million for a local universe gets one bestowal, period, born of a female. And only one I'm sorry, each planet gets one bestowal, and only one planet out of the 10 million gets a creator son with the bestowal, such as we have seen on Urantia. So the missions are pretty typical to be spiritual enlightenment. But I think what Steve brought up in that paragraph, that these emergency provisions are brought out when there is a rebellion, that may be the part that's the emergency part. And I wanted to just, kind of hadn't thought through that until I looked this up. The termination of the Lucifer rebellion actually occurred, and the demarcation of that was that Jesus's baptism there, in the Jordan. So I think that that's a terminal point. It's part of the emergency, and it needs to be done by a creator son. And as we get into a little bit more on what paper 120 and Emmanuel says to Jesus, I think that might actually come out a little bit more. Okay.
Thank you. I would now like to proceed to another possible focus in the background information that I circulated to participants. I highlighted an additional thought that I would like them to consider, and this is because in a different part of the instructions from Emmanuel to Michael, he emphasized that Michael would be living on Urantia, but not just for Urantia. He would be living his bestowal for all planets in his local universe. And I will read that paragraph. This is paragraph 7 in section 2 of paper 120. And Emmanuel states, 7, in all that you may perform on the world of your bestowal, son, bear constantly in mind that you are living a life for the instruction and edification of all your universe. You are bestowing this life of mortal incarnation upon Urantia, but you are to live such a life for the spiritual inspiration of every human and superhuman intelligence that has lived, now exists, or may yet live on every inhabited world which has formed, now forms, or may yet form a part of the vast galaxy of your administrative domain. This again is paragraph 7 in section 2 of paper 120 by Mantutia Melchizedek, but part of the description of Emmanuel's instructions to Michael. So Stephen, does the fact that Michael in the human form of Jesus of Nazareth was living not only for Urantia, but for his entire local universe influence the nature of the instructions about concentrating on spiritual and religious factors?
Yeah, I think so. That's an indication that he does have to focus more on spiritual and ethical instructions that are devoid of particular associations with the situation on Urantia in social, economic, or political terms, because the more particular he would get in that way, the less universal in the literal sense, the less universal his bestowal would have had for the rest of his local universe. So there is a trade-off there. And I think he also, though, I'm speculating here, though he could not get explicitly particular in those ways about particular social or economic or political directions. I think whatever ethical teachings he was able to impart, I think he had in mind that they had to be utilizable or practical in terms of interpretive potential for not only this planet, of course, but everywhere. So I don't think he lived in a totally ideal, spiritualized, idealized realm where nothing he said could have any application. I think that whatever he said, he knew would be most valuable if it could be more easily or more readily applied to specific circumstances. So he had to be really an incarnation of wisdom in that sense, where they were, what he had to say was both truly universal and truly able to be particularized in real life situations. They couldn't be just, totally intellectualized thinking about ethical and spiritual subjects.
Thank you. I would now like to turn to George, but before I do that, in effect, apply some of the insights that I think Stephen has expressed. In Jesus's teachings on Urantia, he, of course, used many references to common situations in life. The story of the Good Samaritan, for example, is one which is still vivid to us today. The story about the wealthy person who was giving a wedding and who was having difficulty getting his guests to come to the wedding, another story of everyday life. So the fact that Jesus was concentrating on spiritual and religious matters did not mean that he was totally disconnected from everyday life. And I think what Stephen said and the examples that I've just given tend to support that even though he was concentrating on spiritual and religious matters, he had to communicate in ways that made sense to the people of his day, and for that matter, that still makes sense to us. George, how do you take that?
Yeah, I agree, but I think I would add that the use of parables is, I never understood it until I read it in your Urantia book. The parables are able, the technique of the parable is able to convey a spiritual truth without interference by the intellect. In other words, because it's so open to interpretation, it's hard for the intellect to block the spiritual message. So in the example of the mustard seed and all the rest of that, it's just a simple idea, but it contains a profound spiritual message or value. And that's why parables should always be focused on a single point. In other words, the spiritual point of the parable. But to talk about seeds and that sort of, it gets around people's intellectual defenses, where if you start talking about it in a more philosophical way, people will always disagree. And, so, yeah, no, I agree with what you said. And Stephen, I think that's a way to convey truth in basically a universal way, since life is universally present on all planets. And I assume all planets have flowering plants that produce seeds, and so it all makes sense.
Thank you. Doreen, you earlier aspired to tell stories. I wonder now if perhaps I could ask you about the value of stories as a technique of teaching and in relation to spirituality, on the understanding that a story that Jesus told presumably, as George has just inferred, would be accessible and meaningful to people living on other inhabited planets. Doreen, you'll have to unmute yourself.
Oh, this is so annoying. I'm sorry. No, the
Is it-
story
is
I
it an-
wanted to.
Is it annoying that you're muted or that you have to unmute yourself?
Well, it's easy on a computer. On the cell phone, it's just this little thing, and oh my goodness. Anyway, what does it matter? Oh, so the stories there was two stories I found I thought was really good, but I wanted to say when I was kind of researching a lot of stuff, and what happens to me, I research too much stuff, I get all overwhelmed, and then I'm all mixed up. So you have to forgive me. I have to do less. That expression, less is more. Number one, when I was researching in the Old Testament books, and, just different kind of things, and it said, they wrote in poetry. I've been talking about my love. I was looking about families and, and how they treated women and divorce and all that other stuff. But it was talking about Israel. And Israel was the love, and everything that they mentioned had twofold way to look at it. And I thought it was really interesting. That's why, probably, it appealed, but that's probably how, of course, Jesus' upbringing was a consequence of a lot of the teachings, because when I was reading, I have noticed a lot of things that Jesus took from there that already they had it. And I didn't know because I never read all that stuff before, as you well know. But on the other hand, if I could tell my story a little bit, and it's not a story which you think would be beneficial for others, but it's a factual story. And it said, number one, it was talking about religion, and this Harvard sociobiologist said the traits of justice, morality, altruism could disappear from the populace in 2 or 3 generations. And he quotes a mountain tribe of Uganda. It's called the Iks, I-K-S. He said they lost all traces of humanistic values. They border on extinction through self-indulgence, greed, indifference to human suffering. And it was partially due also to corrupt government and policies and isolation and mindless exploits. And that sounds like a lot of the things that was said about the youth in the Urantia book. And, it goes on in so many areas that we pick up, over and over again, and we never learn from it. So your question to me was the storytelling from to communicate. Well, I'm not sure if it works for everyone, but first of all, the apostles took it literally. Everything they took literally, and he kept saying, how many times do I have to tell you? But it was something new to them. They just thought every word he said was absolute, and that was it. And so, well, I found another thing, and I'm just jumping around because I always find interesting stuff, but the Urantia book said that I think in Paradise that it would take 10,000 years of our way of learning words where it took 1 hour of their time. Imagine 1 hour to convey the meaning of something, and here 10,000 years. Now, what does that tell you? And so you're trying to figure out, the parables. People, it took time for them you have to have the spirituality, the spiritual understanding. You have to know that level of the adjective mind spirits to recognize what he's saying, and the experience. And I think experience is the greatest teacher ever, 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 because it doesn't, just like the story I told you with Van that the book said, because they, and who was it? The higher beings said, why are you wasting your time with these primitive, humans from the lowest level? And he said, boy, we could certainly learn a lot from what Van did, because they would have never known that unless they had the experience reported to them. So I don't know what else to tell you. There's so many things, but I'm all over the place. Anyway, thank you.
Thank you, Doreen. Bob, I'd like now to perhaps turn to the implications of this paragraph in which Emmanuel told Michael to be aware that he was bestowing his life for all inhabited planets in Abaddon, and perhaps ask you to evaluate or epitomize the degree to which his life would be appealing to people living on another planet, to people perhaps on planets that did not have a rebellion present, and so on. Do you think that this appeal really does exist on the part of the life of Jesus of Nazareth for people on other inhabited planets in his local universe?
I think both directly and indirectly. Directly, George brought up the idea of parables, parabolic analogy, and the intellect doesn't get in the way. I totally concur with that. Parabolic analogy is like the dish. As the photons or the field comes into the dish, the focus goes back to one spot, which is truth. So, that's my metaphor, so to speak, to think about how parabolic analogy works. It's a parabola. It's a dish parabola, and the story hits any part of the context for which the individual personality can envision it in his or her particular material, spiritual, or merantial state, and can apply that. So I think that's the direct use. The indirect, I think, is more so with the Supreme Being. Michael, if we take a look at the introduction to paper 120, and I may be getting into the next question here a little bit, but I think that the question kind of pushes me in that direction. He says that there was a profound elucidation of the meanings of Michael's bestowal in relation to the Paradise Isle, Paradise Trinity, and the Supreme Being. So this was a much different bestowal than a normal avanal bestowal. As I had said before, it's the 1 in 10 million in any local universe. So it's got to be for the entire local universe when a creator son does the bestowal. It's still for spiritual illumination. But this was Michael's seventh and final creature bestowal. And the part of this was to attain supreme sovereignty of the local universe of his making. So there's a lot going on here, much more than we've ever seen, ever heard before. This is a revelation out of this fifth epical revelation that I think is pure, but it's building upon the fourth epical revelation for sure. Michael was a vicegerent sovereign, which is what we brought up before, but the relationship was to the universal father, which was existential relationship. And now his relationship as a human of the realm is an experiential. And it's these two that are coordinated in this life now. So here you have the local universe creator with a relationship to the universal father. Now, as a human of the realm, part of this bestowal has to be able to be experiential, and the two have to meet to be able to create a supremacy value that his local universe will now benefit from. So that's the indirect part that I was bringing up, is that whatever these planets to be or are, or wherever they are, will be able to either understand the Supreme Being a little bit better based upon this parabolic analogy that, for example, a planet that's close to light and life would have completely different perspective as to what the parable would be trying to say. And I think that this idea of experiential is really about the paradise trinity, about paradise, and about the supreme being. So that's the indirect relationship, I think, that this bestowal that Michael made as Jesus is for the entire local universe of his making. Over.
Thank you. I would accept your comment really as related not only to the immediate question we were discussing about the fact that Michael's bestowal was for all of Nebadon, but also the association with the Supreme Being and his achievement of complete sovereignty, as you've described. I would now like to turn to one other thought that I circulated to participants prior to this webinar. We know that Emmanuel's instructions had to do with the Father's will, that the mission of Michael, in effect, was to demonstrate the Father's will. And these are facts. But the question that I posed to them in the information that I circulated is whether or not there might be something about the nature and the characteristics of the Father's will that we could infer, and that might have influenced the instructions that Emmanuel gave in regard to refraining from being active on economic, social, and political matters. Now, I don't know this. I am simply posing a question, and in the information that I circulated to participants before our webinar, I simply gave the following statement as an example. And I will read that, and again, emphasize that this is just an example. Here is what I wrote. The Father's will must be understood to be universal and to apply equally to all eras, contexts, and locations. If Michael, in his human identity as Jesus of Nazareth, were to propose or advocate particular social, political, or economic methods, that would tend to distract from or undermine the conviction that the Father's will really is universal. Now, I offer this to you as a possible thought, but stress that it is simply a possibility and that there may be other principles or concepts that any of you may wish to draw forward in this regard. George, I'll give you the first shot at that.
I guess I have a difficult time because the Father has divested himself of everything that he possibly can. He doesn't have to do anything. And the one thing that he still does is bestow adjusters and bestow personality. So he doesn't need to exercise his will to run the universe or to do administration or any of that. So I guess in a kind of roundabout kind of way, I'm trying to get to the point that I think in its essence, doing the Father's will is a strictly personal relationship. It doesn't directly bear on social, political, economic, historical, doesn't bear on anything else. It's strictly a personal experience. And when I think about it on that level, which is how I typically think about it, I'm often reminded of that statement where I forget the exact place, but it says eternity is related to time, or the gods are related to time as an experience in eternity. And that's, to me, that's a poetic statement, as Bob would say, and I really liked what you said. It's a parabolic statement, which if you look at it, it focuses your attention in such a way that it takes you out of time and space to someplace else. That's where the parabolic focus is.
Thank you, George. Doreen, is there something about the nature of the Father's will and Michael's need to demonstrate the Father's will that influenced Emmanuel's instructions, or do you see something else in this? Doreen?
Sorry, I start to talk and I forget. Nevertheless, I don't know. When you know the God, when you know the Father's will, the will is absolute. You always benefit from it. He never destroys anything. He always acts, but never to coerce. And the wonderful things that you could be so comforted and inspired by, and so enthralled and intrigued, and all the things they talk about, to allow the justice to constantly bring forth the pictures of the real motive, the final aim, the eternal purpose of all this difficult uphill struggle with the commonplace problems of your present material world. What would we do without it? We have, the revelation was so necessary, absolutely so necessary, especially today, where we see there is an emergency for sure. And it's funny, I was looking up the word Emmanuel, and it means God within us. It was interesting. So you're talking about the spiritual message, of course, and we have to preserve that message. We have to preserve the relationship. When we have a relationship with our Father, there is nothing greater than that. And then you have, the spirits of the mother. You have the spirit of truth. It blows me away because it is the most beautiful experience. So why did Emmanuel give him the message? The message contains much more than just the message. And we said it before. And as you read with all the social stuff, it falls into place. The golden rule. What does it mean? Genuine brotherhood, right? That's when all men really have rose the occasion where they actually desire to practice to bear each other's burdens. All the things. How do you change the world? How does it grow? How does it evolve a new social order, better governments? If you didn't have the original message, because you could break it down into many levels. And when your mind starts to transform, you don't treat people the same way. You don't see the same things. So the original, yes, through the religious relationship with God, absolutely. And when you have that, it makes you much more than what you are. And there's something alive inside of you, and you know it. When you're talking about the spirit of truth, you know when the spirit of truth is active. You gives you the power and the energy to go forth and share and to help other people and to do service. And to me, you have so many agencies where you put out all the 12 orders of the angelic beings, the master seraphim, and you read all the stuff that they do, and to help us. So this is all part of the plan. He doesn't have to do everything. All the other stuff is happening as a result of it anyway. But it's a mandate for all the worlds, of course, for all the worlds. It has to be for all the worlds he was speaking, but the example that he's acting it out, they have, of course, the information in the living libraries from that, which again, that was another question where they got all mixed up. They didn't know how to express it. But nevertheless, what else could you have given to this planet after all the defaults and all the backwardness and the barbarians? And you still have a lot of stuff that's remnants from that. We still have war. This is, we haven't come out of it, and I think it's going to be quite a long time where we really establish a better political system, a social system, economic conditions. And but there was one more thing if I can quickly tell you that they were talking about races of men superficially accepting a strange new religion. This is Christianity. And they actually adjust to it, to their mores and old ways of believing. It said this well illustrated by the example of a certain New Zealand tribe whose priest, after nominally accepting Christianity, professed to have received direct revelations from Gabriel to the effect that this self-same tribe had become the chosen people of God and directed that they be permitted freely to indulge in loose sex relations and numerous other of their olden and reprehensible customs. And immediately all of the new-made Christians went over to this new and less exacting version of Christianity. So, I mean, to me, it was in a nutshell, right, you could put it out there, but you can't force feed the people religion. It doesn't work. So you have to come to it, through the Spirit's gravity force. And okay, I'll stop.
Thank you, Bob. You now have the role of being the cleanup hitter, and I'm not going to throw a curveball at you, although I enjoy that, and you apparently enjoy it too. But clearly, the idea that Emmanuel was speaking on behalf of the Father and that Christ Michael in the human form of Jesus of Nazareth was living as a demonstration of the Father's will had an influence on everything that Emmanuel said. But is there, in your view, something that we can infer as a concept or principle associated with the Father's will that influenced these particular teachings? These particular instructions that Emmanuel gave to Michael?
Yes, Neil. Thank you. You definitely piqued my interest with your statement here that you read, and I spent a little bit of time thinking about it. You said that the Father's will must be understood to be universal, and if Jesus did anything other than spiritual enlightenment, it would distract or undermine from the Father's will as being universal. So, okay, the Father's will is infinite, so that's universal. I get that, but it kind of caught my eye a little bit to think that, well, is the Father really speaking directly, or is he speaking indirectly? And the more I thought about this, and just mentioned that part of the bestowal was to be supreme sovereign, and Jesus is in the introduction there were three statements that were very interesting that pointed me in this direction here. Emmanuel is saying Michael will live his bestowal with paradise cooperation. I had these bullets written down here. Cooperative subordination to the paradise trinity. And Emmanuel, once he's finished with this bestowal, he will have a supremacy of administration. So this is pointing to the paradise trinity, which gets us into the experiential part of the supreme being, because the paradise trinity, the supreme being is the functional experiential output of the Trinity. And the bestowal was the sevenfold bestowal from the Trinity. All the six previous, our Venn diagram shows up, and there's 6 locations, and the last one here was to the will of the universal Father. Well, is it the universal Father? There's a very interesting statement in paper 107 where a solitary messenger says, any mortal who has seen a creator son has seen the universal Father. And he who is indwelt by a divine adjuster is indwelt by the paradise Father. So again, this almost was a paradox for me. It certainly is a conundrum. What's the difference between the universal Father and the paradise Father? And if we start to take a look at Emmanuel, he's a union of days. The union of days is the Well, it's they're part of all the days, the perfections of days who operate at the major sector, the recents of days operate at the minor sector, and the union of days operates at the local universe level. The constellation day is the faithful of days. I bring all this up to say that Emmanuel is down in the local universe, so he's saying that he's acting in behalf of the universal Father. Is he talking directly to the universal Father? I suspect not. He's probably getting the downstep from the ancients of days, who are getting the downstep from Master Spirit number one, because of the Paradise Trinity. Don't forget that the Paradise Trinity is the seven Master Spirits are coordinate to the Paradise Trinity for each of the super universes. So what is I'll come to a point here. What does the Master Spirit number one actually do? Paper 16 talks quite a bit about this, and I'll just read what the Master Spirit, this is called the Seven Master Spirits, which is the paper on that. Master Spirit number one. In a special manner, this spirit is the direct representation of the Paradise Father. He is a peculiar and efficient manifestation of the power, love, and wisdom of the Universal Father. Not the Paradise Father, the Universal Father. He is the close associate and the supernal advisor of the chief of the mystery monitors, that being who presides over the College of Personalized Adjusters on Divinington. Paradise. We're getting to paradise here. In associations of the seven Master Spirits, it is always Master Spirit number one who speaks for the Universal Father. The union of days then is at the local level. So is there some kind of downstepping going on from the infinite will of the Father that is concerned with everything, universally everything, through the Paradise Trinity to the Master Spirits to the Creator Sons? And I go back to what I said earlier about the existential and the experiential creating this supremacy aspect of the Supreme Being, all embodied in this Creator Son who has come down as a human being. What a task he had. The more I think about this task, the more I think that it's almost unfathomable. I do want to mention one thing. Doreen brought up the definition of the name Emmanuel. It's God within us. I think that's really good because we're talking about these, the Paradise Trinity here, which is, effectively the Paradise. Going back to the Paradise Father is one who has seen the adjuster. He who is indwelt by a divine adjuster is indwelt by the Paradise Father. So the Universal Father, Neil, I don't know how to make that statement any better than what you did there. It's pretty exoteric, but it does get the point across quite well. I'm not so sure that it would distract or undermine from the conviction of the Father's will, but it's not what the bestowal was about, for sure. And I wanted to make one other point, something that George brought up, but I forgot that. One other interesting thing, Doreen, you brought up that story about the Aborigines and during World War II, the Christians. In my looking up Christianity and where I thought we were going to get to, there's a really interesting article by a very famous historian, Lynn White Jr., and it's called The Historical Roots of Our Ecological Crisis. And Neil, you'd be interested that he does point to the facets of Christianity and what evolved out of that, which we'll probably get to at some point, that has created at least the Western side of the ecological crisis. And he was writing this in 1967. And Doreen, he put that story out there to explain what actually actually happens without any grounding on the Christian religion, to say the least. So
Oh, I didn't know that.
yeah, that was quite interesting. I just read it a couple days ago. So nice find on that one. And well, that's about it at this one here. And if I can think about what point I wanted to get back with George's points, I'll just raise my hand. Over to you, Nick.
Thank you, Bob. But I will call on you in a minute, Stephen. In terms of the vocabulary question that was included in your remarks, universal father and paradise father, from my own personal perspective, I treat that simply as a matter of vocabulary and synonyms, just as the infinite spirit is sometimes called the God of action. So I think the revelators feel that they should vary their diction, vary their vocabulary, but I believe that the phrase paradise father and the phrase universal father mean the same thing. Stephen, your turn.
Yeah, I don't think I got to comment on this number 4. If I did, I have amnesia.
I'm sorry, did I miss you?
I think
apologize.
so. I think so. Because there was a point I definitely wanted to make, but before that, a couple of things. I believe that Emmanuel means God with us, not God within us. And it's a slight difference, but it's an important difference. I believe that is the common translation. Also, as far as parables go, the Hebrew word for parable, for the Greek word parable, is mashal, which in Hebrew means mystery. And what Jesus was doing was something that was very common in the prophetic tradition in Israel, and also in the wisdom tradition in Israel, where the prophets or the sages would say something that was very profound, but very simple at the same time. And that was considered to be mysterious, because how could you say something very profound and very simple at the same time? So the Hebrew understanding of parable is mystery, which is congruent to what we were talking about as far as parabolic understanding goes. So the point on number 4 is something you implied when you say the Father's will must be understood to be universal and to apply equally to all eras, contexts, and locations. You implied that in order to be universal, the Father's will must be absolutely particular to every event and every ethical decision every intelligent being in the universe makes. If the Father's will was not absolutely unique to every individual decision, it could not be universal. So it is just as important to say that the Father's will is absolutely unique as it is to say it's absolutely universal. If you just say it's absolutely universal, you're really missing out, to me, the really important part of what universal means. Universal means absolutely relevant and ultimately absolutely relevant to each and every intelligent will decision in the universe. That is what the Father's will is. It's not an abstract universal understanding or concept. It takes place in the actual will decision of every intelligent being.
Thank you. I welcome your interpretation of these phrases, and I would stress once again that the 2 sentences that I put forward in the introductory material that I circulated to all of you before our webinar were intended solely as an illustration and not as an assertion. So your interpretation is very interesting, and it contributes once again to our spirit of pluralism and diversity. Well, I think we've done the discussion concerning these concepts and principles that one could conceivably associate with the Father's will. The 5th item that I put forward as a possibility had to do with the role of Michael's bestowal in connection with achieving supreme sovereignty and the relationship to the supreme being. Bob has spoken about that on a couple of occasions, and perhaps what he has said is sufficient. I wonder if any of the others of you, Stephen, George, or Doreen, would like to comment on the association with the supreme and the idea of developing supreme sovereignty as an element of Michael's bestowal. If anyone wishes to discuss that, please signify. I don't see any volunteers, and therefore, gentlemen and lady, we have had an extremely interesting discussion of this single paragraph from Emmanuel's instructions to Michael. I would now like to turn the page in my essay, Living the Real Religion of Jesus, that is to say, moving on to the top of page 12, and to ask, let's see, perhaps George, if you are available, could you read those succeeding two paragraphs, numbers 4 and 5 at the top of page 12, please? You'll have to unmute.
You have to give me a chance to bring it up here.
Okay.
Okay, two paragraphs.
Right.
Under no circumstances, and not even in the least detail, should you interfere with the normal and orderly progressive evolution of the Urantia races. But this prohibition must not be interpreted as limiting your efforts to leave behind you on Urantia an enduring and improved system of positive religious ethics. As a dispensational son, you are granted certain privileges pertaining to the advancement of the spiritual and religious status of the world peoples. 5. As you may see fit, you are to identify yourself with existing religious and spiritual movements as they may be found on Urantia, but in every possible manner seek to avoid the formal establishment of an organized cult, a crystallized religion, or a segregated ethical grouping of mortal beings. Your life and teachings are to become the common heritage of all religions and all peoples.
Thank you. These two paragraphs contain many strands of analysis that are profound and deep. I would state, just for the comfort zone of the participants today, that we are not going to exhaust all the ideas contained in these two paragraphs in the time remaining. But I would like to turn at least to the beginning of the discussion pertaining to paragraph 4 that George read, specifically the first sentence: under no circumstances and not even in the least detail should you interfere with the normal and orderly progressive evolution of the Urantia races. Now, one of the gaps, of course, that occurred because of the failure of the second epochal revelation was the resulting failure to upgrade the human stock, which was one of the major tasks of Adam and Eve. And here, Emmanuel is telling Christ Michael that he should not get into this at all. Bob, why do you think that prohibition existed?
Why is the fourth epochal revelation, why is Michael being prohibited to, even in the least detail, to interfere with the normal and orderly progression of evolution? Well, there's a lot of parts of this evolution. There's social evolution, political evolution.
Well, excuse me, the sentence is of the Urantia races. So we're talking about biological and personal development here, the races.
Yeah, I didn't see it as just biological. The Adam and Eves are supposed to take us up to the biological pinnacle in their part of their mission. One of the reasons why we're where we are today with coronavirus, in my opinion, we don't have enough of that violet race to be able to withstand some of these things.
Excuse me. So I take it from your remarks that you're interpreting the final phrase, evolution of the Urantia races, to apply more broadly than just to biological aspects.
I did, yes. And I think that's, all of the evolution, industrial, spiritual, each of the races has different levels of evolution, and if you look at the progression of a normal planet, the races will be blended at some point. I think because of the great divergence, and because of the default of Adam and Eve, and not reaching any of those levels, any of those evolutionary levels, from agriculture to economics to industry. That's how I read it. Is that it's not only just specifically biological evolution, but it's all of those tracks that each of the races on the planet, if that was part of the bestowal mission that Michael was to perform as Jesus, it would have created, frankly, it just seems logical that it would have created more problems than it even attempted to solve. So the spiritual enlightenment, of course, is the one that was focused. Back over.
Thank you, George. And picking up from where Bob left off, I wonder if you could comment on the phrase, the normal and orderly progressive evolution. Is this, in effect, solidifying and consecrating an extended process in time, normal and orderly progressive evolution?
Yeah, I interpreted that as referring specifically to race in a biological sense. And so the only thing that makes sense to me is, being the creator son, he has inherent powers, and he might have been tempted to fix some genetic problems while he was here. That's the only thing I can think of. I honestly have a hard time understanding what they mean by interfering with the biological genetics of the races of Urantia.
Okay, I understand, but what I'm in effect asking you to comment on, perhaps, is the idea of progressive evolution. Doesn't that phrase, progressive evolution, imply a lengthy period of time?
Oh, absolutely. We were told 1,043 times that evolution takes a long time. Everywhere in the book, every page, everything takes time. Nothing except for moral and spiritual decisions. Those can be done on the spur of the moment. But everything else, so the normal progressive evolution of Urantia races is something which happens over eons. Well, at least millennia. Well, many millennia. We haven't really changed that much from what humans were 2,000 years ago or 5,000 years ago. So, at least I don't think we have.
Thank you. Stephen, are you largely content with the general discussion so far about normal and orderly progressive evolution? Bob interpreted the concluding phrase of the Urantia races as more than simply biological. I don't know how you look at this.
Yeah, I would agree with Bob. I think that's just the phraseology they use. They are comfortable describing humanity as the Urantia races. It's not a term we would typically use 100 years later, but yeah, I wouldn't let anybody get thrown off by that as, to me, primarily biological. I think orderly progressive evolution means on all aspects of human civilization on the planet.
Okay, thank you. Doreen, is there something in this first sentence that attracts your attention that you would like to comment on?
Well, I don't have the papers. I'm sorry.
I'll read the sentence for you if you would like me to do that. It says, under no circumstances and not even in the least detail should you interfere with the normal and orderly progressive evolution of the Urantia races. This is an instruction from Emmanuel to Michael.
Okay, I remember reading that now. Yeah. So of course not. you know, they said, it's funny, they said that they could give us the whole plan of what a perfect government is, but we have to earn it somehow. We have to work towards discovering that, and that's the experience, because otherwise it'll revert back. So there was, let's see, mankind struggled to perfect government, and it had to do with perfecting channels of administration, adapting them to current needs. It's always changing, and improving the distribution within the government, and then selecting administrative leaders that are truly wise. And there's a divine and ideal form of government, which cannot be revealed, but must be slowly and laboriously discovered by the men and women of each planet, of each universe, of time and space. So, yeah, it says the present social order is not necessarily right, it's not divine, it's not sacred, but mankind would do well to move slowly in making the changes, because make changes, make certain when you change the social order, you change it for the better. So that's why, to me, everything has to be slowly gained, and somebody could show, oh, here is absolutely the best, but you wouldn't know how to get there, you know, because you could see somebody's in a position of authority right away, you know, all the different isms took over, you know, that in the world, and then everything went backwards, so it retrogresses. And then all the ethics, you know, and I was reading about the ethics. Oh my God, there are so many schools of ethics all the way up to paradise. And then as much as you know doesn't mean you know how to apply it at each level. They have to show you how to do that. So knowledge is one thing, application is another. It was such fascinating stuff, exploring all these things that I haven't read in such a long time. But anyway, thank you. I hope I answered something.
Thank you, Doreen. I would like now to go into the succeeding sentences of that same paragraph, and I will read them for convenience. But this prohibition must not be interpreted as limiting your efforts to leave behind you on Urantia an enduring and improved system of positive religious ethics. As a dispensational son, you are granted certain privileges pertaining to the advancement of the spiritual and religious status of the world peoples. Is this, in effect, a consequence, or perhaps the other side of the exclusion in the previous paragraph we read, paragraph 3, that Jesus was not to attend to social, economic, and political matters, but instead, here in this paragraph, Emmanuel is telling him that he is free and indeed expected to work on religious ethics of a positive kind and the spiritual and religious status of the world peoples. Stephen, does that in effect amount to the other half of the prohibition we were talking about earlier?
Yeah, seems that way. It's basically a positive way of stating what was said in a negative syntax in the previous sentence. So two sides of the same coin, I would say.
And without wishing to telescope this too much, I infer a judgment on your part that Jesus really did do this, that this is a key feature of his life on Urantia.
Oh yeah, oh yeah. We talked about this already, but that was the great advantage of using the parables, that he was able to do this in a way that made people think outside the box, so to speak, and maybe question certain assumptions that they typically made about things, and challenge them ethically and intellectually. So it was a wonderful tool for him. And even though he inherited, like I said before, he inherited certain traditions, prophetic and wisdom traditions, he really innovated quite a bit. And I think the book talks about that he was an innovator in the usage of these wisdom and prophetic traditions. So yeah, definitely.
George, in effect, Stephen has reinforced the phrase "an enduring and improved system of positive religious ethics." Are those conclusions of his ones that you would share, that the system of ethics that Jesus proclaimed was enduring and improved as compared with what he inherited by virtue of the traditions available before him?
The qualified, yes. Jesus definitely elevated the status of women in society, which lasted for a while and then went away, but is now back. So you can say it's still here after 2,000 years. Took a roundabout way to get there, but the treatment of children also improved. He presented the ethics, his constant willingness to interrupt profound discourses, to stoop down and talk to children who were tugging on his clothing, made a real impression. And I can't think of other specific examples, but yeah, no, I agree that I think he made really positive changes in human ethics.
Thank you. Bob, would you like to chime in on this particular point? I understand, of course, that we are not going to have the opportunity to exhaust discussion of this point. And I also understand that formal question I, which appears later in the page, on the page of Living the Real Religion of Jesus, does probe the question of ethics. But there may be additional thoughts that you would like to share with us at this stage.
Sure, thanks, Neil. I'll be brief. I know we are coming up against our time here. I'll tell you what my process was to look at this term called positive religious ethics, and then to attack that as an improved, or to understand that, I should say, attack my research as an improved system. I hadn't really dug in that deeply on that particular element. So I started with ethics. Got some definitions of those. I'm not going to do all of that here for this one. If we have some time in the next webinar, I can do that, Neil. And what's the difference between religious ethics and non-religious ethics? I think that's a very interesting one. And then why did Emmanuel tag positive in front of that? So I thought, okay, well, I'm sure that we have, and also, this system has to be a system that would be enduring for the entire planet, for entire ranches. So Confucianism, Shinto, Zoroastrianism would have to be able to plug into this positive religious ethic in a way that not only the philosophical religions would be able to do that, but also the dogmatic ones. So this is kind of those 6 words are really complex, and sent me down a rabbit hole, to say the least, to be able, it was quite worthwhile to understand what is a religious ethic. Found out that there's actually a journal called the Journal of Religious Ethics that has some really wonderful articles to take a look at. Always, trying to use the Urantia papers as a backdrop against, what those articles might be saying. Just to kind of mention a couple things, they're from Melchizedek to Jesus, there was a pretty good system of negative religious ethics, and that would be the 10 Commandments. I felt, I suppose that could be disputed, but it's a pretty good system, and it worked and still works. 4,000, 3,500 years later from Moses. So I consider that as a system, and to take a look at the the golden rule, for example, seems to be one that fits into this parabolic analogy. Steve, you had a term for that I can't remember right now that kind of fit that a couple of webinars ago. Can't think of it right now, but
Analogical?
Which one?
Analogical?
Yes, that was it. That's what I see has to happen here to be able to be universal and enduring, across the planet, and potentially for the entire system for the entire local university of Lebanon, potentially. So that's my initial thoughts, Neil. Dug in pretty deeply on morals, ethics, and law. And if we have some time, I realize I can't do all that now. I'd kind of like to take where my research took me on that one.
Thank you. I appreciate your judgment that we will have additional time next week, and we will indeed. It seems to me that there is an implied logical distinction in this paragraph that may not be evident at first. In the first sentence, it talks about normal and orderly progressive evolution. In the final sentence, it talks about certain privileges. And so the idea of privileges, in effect, is a contrast with normal and orderly progressive evolution. It seems to imply that there is a leap here, that in regard to religious ethics, there is a huge leap that Michael is being authorized to make. Whereas in regard to the other aspects of the normal and orderly progressive evolution, he was instructed not to make any leaps. Does that make sense to you, Bob?
Yeah, that's an interesting juxtaposition. I can appreciate that. He definitely, as a dispensational son, it starts out. We know that there's going to be a dispensation here, which is an era. We talked about that earlier here today. But his privileges are to advance both spiritual and religious status of the world's people. So, again, we go to, the entire planet. I suspect we're talking about that sentence is dealing with Urantia, but I would tend to think from our discussion today that we're talking about, the entire, maybe the planets that are to be inhabited would be able to benefit. But I kind of think that it was done for all of Lebanon.
Thank you. Doreen, I would now like to turn to you and perhaps ask you to comment on one of the remarks that George made, namely that Jesus's advancement in the status of women and respect for women as human beings and equals was notable for his day, but did not last, and perhaps now is coming back into progressive realization in an imperfect way. How do you react to that idea?
Oh my goodness. Oh, okay, I'm unmuted, right? So I was reading about the laws regarding marriage and divorce, and Jesus' teaching, again, of course, was to appeal to his entire universe. So, but every progressing world culture develops their own morals and ethics and the rules of living. So what transcends time and expresses a universal appeal is, of course, truth, love, and wisdom. And the Mosaic laws, Jesus' life would never withstand the evolutionary changes that were to come, where people were stoned to death for adultery. Divorce could only be obtained by the husband for the least reason. And it was burning the food, speaking too loud, not attractive. Like a wife was the husband's most valued possession, even though all those things, he had so much power. And it wasn't until the Enlightenment period of the 18th century in England and France that patriarchal power declined and consensual marriages became the practice and became a contract, a partnership to people. But it was amazing to read, how they looked at the female as if, stoned, and they also stoned the men to death as well, so as we well know. But it was just, how would that ever exist, beyond that time period? It wouldn't. People would be, when I think about it, it's just beyond the pale. But yeah, that was what it was. That was those laws then. And of course, Jesus had to say what he said. Oh my God, but it went back anyway, didn't matter. And even today you see with some of the religious groups that, women have to hide their faces. It still exists, these archaic, teachings from some primitive existence. But look, it's easy to give power to one group of people, isn't it? And over another. That's what people have to learn, you know, the spirituality. That's where religion comes in, but the religion of the spirit and all, yeah, and it's funny because I forgot who said the Ten Commandments, but all religions have a form of it. You know, they all borrowed. And of course, you can only come together in the highest level of spirituality. All the religions can agree on that. So, and that's the only way things will change. Otherwise, go show them, you know, a God of love, right?
Thank you, Doreen. I believe now we've come to a good point to state that we've had a very interesting preliminary discussion of this paragraph 4, that we will be able to return to it, and certainly we will consider subsequently question I later in the page that pertains also to positive religious ethics. Paragraph 5 perhaps is going to be even more interesting in terms of the potential for different ways of analyzing what is said in that paragraph. But I think we will have an extremely interesting discussion next week. And I appreciate the participation and the insights and ideas that all of you have put forward today. Thank you very much, and goodbye.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.
Bye, Steve.
Bye.
All right.